all the excitement of the Hunger Games, minus the dead children. This is the Talkin' Boxing with Billy C show.
Talkin' Boxing with Billy C.
Now let's dig into our archives and hear a rare interview when Billy C first became the champion of boxing talk radio. Hello, Billy C. As the new champ, can we ask you a few questions?
Why, certainly.
Okay, your fans would like to know how you and your corner have successfully walloped the competition.
We're not ordinary people. We're morons.
Anything else?
I'm a victim of circumstance.
Did your success finally come when you made the show 5 days a week for 2 hours? What do you think?
I'm trying to think, but nothing happens.
Now, please tell the listeners what you've learned from making it this far.
Certainly. If at first you don't succeed, keep on sucking till you do succeed.
Great words of wisdom, Billy C. Keep up the great work as the undisputed People's Champion with your show, Talkin' Boxing with Billy C. Any last words to anyone who's listening?
This is your fault, you bonehead.
And we're back. You're listening to the Talkin' Boxing with Billy C show. Glad you could join us. And don't forget about following us on Twitter. We'd appreciate it. It's at Talkin' Boxing. That's TalkinBoxing. You might as well check out our website, too. A lot of good stuff there, including, I know you're dying to get a copy of my new book, so check out the website for some information on that, www.billycboxing.com. But enough about me. It's time for
Blast from the Past. We shine the spotlight again on fighters from years past.
Top-ranking Joe Louis is the leading contender.
Joe Frazier with a left hook. Good right hand thrown by Foreman that time. Look at that left hook. Belt that goes to Ray Mancini.
It's Blast from the Past on Talkin' Boxing.
And this week's Blast from the Past, which is being brought to us by KOFantasyBoxing.com. Check them out. Features former two-divisional world champion James Buddy McGirt. And joining me right now to tell us all about James Buddy McGirt is my man, Alex Pierpaoli. What's up, brother?
Good evening, Billy C. How are you?
Not too bad. What's all this revolutionary talk in the chat room? I mean, we were trying to be revolutionary with the rotating schedule, but logistics, man. You throw people a curve today, and it just everybody gets all discombobulated. You know, it's crazy.
Yeah, that is unfortunate.
I know. We'll see what happens. There's just some logistics we got to work out, you know. But, you said you wanted to get a little closer to more modern times. We usually pick guys that are way older than us even. But James Buddy McGirt, this is a guy that's actually younger than me. What a character, great guy. Most people see him up at the Hall of Fame. Tell us about James Buddy McGirt.
Yeah, I like this choice because he was somebody who, right in the era of boxing where I started becoming a fan, one of the first pro fight cards that I went to was, he was not fighting on it, but he was there in the crowd. And then the second pro fight card I went to at the Phelps Forum, he was the main event. I was definitely a fan of his. And he went on to be a trainer, too, so there's a cool dimension there that he's, has a double identity in the sport.
Well, he's like those guys. You remember, like we always refer to boxing as a trade. Well, he's one of these rare, more modern guys that follow that rule that we say. People aren't into the. We need boxing people. This is an example of a guy that has made boxing his life. As a kid, in the amateurs, and then as a pro, and now as one of the top trainers.
Absolutely. I mean, he looked at it as a craft. Something you talk about a lot, and his career certainly shows that it was a craft to him, that he looked at the sport that way. But James Buddy McGirt, the name I have actually is James Walter McGirt, born January 17th, 1964 in Brentwood, New York. That's actually on Long Island. He was 5'6.5", or is 5'6.5", and he fought at junior welter and welter. His trainer and manager, who I believe he had his whole career, was Al Certo. And this was he was a very savvy boxer. He could punch a little, and he did have a big KO of a terrific amateur standout who never really went anywhere as a pro. And Buddy McGirt saw to that when he stopped Howard Davis. I think that was like on a Saturday afternoon on ABC.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And not only that, we were talking about free TV. Not only that, he destroyed him in like one round, I believe, right? Was it one round?
Yeah, stopped him in one round, big right hand. And it was an interesting, because that was going to looked to be a very interesting fight, because you had stylistic matchup that was interesting. McGirt, the much smaller guy, fighting a tall guy who could box. He expected, that Davis was going to try to outbox him, but he caught him early, and it was funny because that was one of the things that I do remember liking about him, because he was. This was right in the Tyson era, and he was one of the welterweights that I was a fan of. You know, I grew up in New Haven, the New Haven County of Connecticut. So you either were here, you're either a New York fan or a Boston fan, and I, of course, liked all the New York fighters. And Buddy McGirt was one of the ones I liked, and I remember that he did have a side to him that he could be a little ornery, and they were. When he stopped Howard Davis, I see an article here by Phil Berger, who was a New York Times writer that I liked very much of that time, and he said that they were trying to set up the fight with Meldrick Taylor, and Taylor was in the crowd, and McGirt made it very clear he was in no mood to think about Taylor. You know, that's it's his night. He just beat Howard Davis.
Howard Davis. You know, people forget. First of all, he was one of the first fighters I met personally. I met him on a plane going to Vegas one time in the beginning of his career. But this is a guy that he won Fighter of the Olympics in the same Olympics that Sugar Ray Leonard was in. You know, I mean, this is how good this guy. You say he was a great amateur. I mean, that might even just be an understatement. I mean, he was the Fighter of the Olympics. You know, and he could never turn that into as the same type of success as a pro. But maybe Buddy McGirt had something to do with that. You know, I mean, Buddy McGirt was one of those blue-collar fighters, you know. Howard Davis was more of I'm not saying he was privileged, but he seemed like he was on that other level in terms of, you know, reputation and the way people looked at him. And Buddy McGirt was this blue-collar fighter, and, you know, I always go for those guys, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I hear you. And that was one of the things I was looking at, is that he had a lot of fights for the modern era. He ends up with a career record of quite a few fights.
80.
And if you look at them, the pace. His first year as a pro, 7 fights. Second year, 6 fights. He was always fighting more than 5 fights. 5 fights. 1985, his fourth year as a pro, 6 fights. The first loss he had was to Frankie Warren, where he slugged instead of boxed. And he does say that Frankie Warren was the toughest fighter he ever fought. But he avenged that defeat and stopped Frankie Warren. That fight's on YouTube. That was a really good fight. But, yeah, 7 fights again in 86, 7 in 87. So he was a very busy fighter. And you're right, Howard Davis did retire, at least temporarily, after being stopped by Buddy McGirt, but he did have a small comeback, and he ended up being defeated by Dana Rosenblatt, which I looked that up, and I was a little surprised to see that.
That was talk about a New England guy. Wasn't he from Rhode Island?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
He was.
Now, McGirt, you talk about the frequency in which he fought. The other thing that I always admired about Buddy McGirt was that he never really retired and came back. You know, he fought consistently from the time he turned pro in 82 all the way up until his last fight in 1997, and then never went back, you know, got into training and stuff. And I love when guys do that. I think it's very rare that a fighter knows when to say when, you know, and even though he didn't retire as a world champion, you know, and he did retire coming off a loss. We'll get to his record a little bit later. I mean, this was an extremely respectable fighter during his active career. Now, explain to anyone that's never seen him fight. What's his style? Explain his style to the viewers and listeners.
Well, you know, he can box very well, but because he was he wasn't really tall. He almost, you could say that he kind of fought out of a crouch at times. A really good left hook, and that was something that eventually caused a problem. Was that he had a bad shoulder, had some tendonitis in that left shoulder. Eventually, had some surgeries on it. That ended up being, and I couldn't help, especially listening to the first part of the show while I was running the Sims. It's interesting, his fights with Pernell Whitaker. They're sort of a little bit, they remind me of what happened with Pacquiao-Mayweather, where, McGirt in the Pacquiao role, where he had a bad shoulder going into the fight that he thought was mostly healed. They had checked it out quite a few times, but then when the fight finally happened, the first couple of rounds, he threw 4 to 6 left hooks in those first couple rounds, and then you just didn't see him throw them anymore. And it was the same kind of thing in the Pacquiao-Mayweather fight, where the early going was sort of competitive, and then Pacquiao stopped being Manny Pacquiao.
Well, and Pernell Whitaker definitely was playing the Floyd role. He was always a safety first guy, you know.
Yeah, and that's the thing about it, is that Buddy McGirt, in a way, he. I don't know, but this is something that, in a way, he's kind of like Fernando Vargas, in a sense, I thought, because he came around at a time where there were two names that were just guys he couldn't beat. One was Melvin Taylor, who was a badass, and the other was Pernell Whitaker, who was a badass. And the Melvin Taylor loss, that was a really good fight, too. That was, I think, also on network TV on a Saturday afternoon. That's on YouTube. And that fight was, if Buddy McGirt won that fight, he was going to get the fight with Julio Cesar Chavez. So right around these welterweights at the time there, you had Julio Cesar Chavez, Melvin Taylor, Pernell Whitaker, and James Buddy McGirt, all sort of vying for who was the best welterweight, and also therefore the best fighter pound for pound. All those guys, were staking a claim, and McGirt did fight two of them, and unfortunately was defeated by both.
Yeah, the other thing though was, and this is what makes the eras so different. They wanted to fight each other. All these fights that have, we're mentioning these names, and the only guys on each other's radar was each other. They wanted to prove, and that's how the complexion of this sport has changed so drastically, because now fighters are content with holding a piece of the title and parading around trying to convince the fans that they're the real deal, and don't want any part of the other guys for whatever reason, whether they're think it's too risky, whether the promoters don't work together, the networks don't work. I mean, there's just so many other variables involved now, and it's a shame, because at some point the sport is going to suffer worse than it is, but the fans are already suffering. The sad part is they may not even know it.
True. I did want to mention, because I thought the same thing. I was like, well, wait a minute. Did when Melvin Taylor beats McGirt, did he slip right into that spot and take the next date with Chavez? And no, he did not. If you look, because there's like about another year and a half before he meets Chavez in March of 1990. So they did let that fight marinate a bit. Whether it was because Chavez didn't want a guy who was as speedy as Melvin Taylor. I mean, at the time, that was really what beat Buddy McGirt. He's 21 at the time. Meldrick Taylor, he was fast, and he just was too much for Buddy McGirt. So maybe that was one of the things they talked about. Is the winner gets Chavez. It didn't happen quite that easily, but it did happen a year and a half later, and of course we got an instant classic with Chavez Taylor.
Well, Buddy McGirt beat Saul Manby, like you mentioned. That was a big win for him in 1986, got him into that contender role. The Roger Brown win was an impressive win in 87, which basically got him his shot at his first world title against Frankie Warren, in which he was successful. The Howard Davis Jr. fight was a defense of that. And then, as we're talking about Meldrick Taylor, he lost that fight. And then, ends up going up in weight. And in 1991, after a string of impressive victories, he fights Simon Brown, who at the time was a pretty badass. I mean, Simon Brown wasn't the Simon Brown that people remember at the end of his career. This was in 1991, and he won a pretty exciting 12-rounder in that. Tell us about that fight.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that might be his best performance. He looked incredible in that fight, and he really dominated Simon Brown. And at the time he only had the 2 losses. He had the Frankie Warren loss and then the Meldrick Taylor loss. One of the things that we did, I forgot to mention, was that this is a guy who his very first fight, he gets a draw. So he's somebody who, kind of like a Bernard Hopkins, didn't get discouraged right out of the box, But yeah, he ends up beating Simon Brown. That fight's on YouTube. It was a Showtime fight, and now he's got a piece of the welterweight title. So yeah, he becomes one of the players there. And the next fight that seems, that people start, getting people's mouth watering is the idea of him facing off against Pernell Whitaker.
And the other thing about these names, Pernell Whitaker, we're talking about Meldrick Taylor, Frankie Warren, even Simon Brown, and then, Livingstone Bramble. These are all guys, Julio Cesar Chavez with the Meldrick Taylor fight. These are all guys that moved up all together. They all started out, not so much Buddy McGirt. I mean, I don't think he started out at lightweight, maybe his first fight, but he was pretty much a junior welterweight. And but a lot of those other fighters started out at the lower weight divisions. They all seemed to move up at the same time. It wasn't like they were moving up to avoid each other. It was almost like they were moving up to show that they could still contend. You know what I mean? And it seems different. Again, I could throw a wrench in that today. Right? Sometimes fighters seem to move up to move away.
Yeah, they were sort of growing, and especially in the case of Meldrick Taylor. I mean, him being so young. But McGirt was young too. I mean, what is he, like 25 at this time, 26? But yeah, the Gennaro Leone fight, which was the one in January of '93, right before Whitaker, that was the one that did sort of throw a little bit of a question about how he might do against Whitaker, because he ended up his shoulder, the injury really showed in that fight. He didn't throw many left hooks. A lot of times he goes back to the corner, and on TV you could hear him saying to, or Al Cerdo saying, "Give me left hooks," and him saying, "I can't." And the last round of that Leone fight, he did get hurt. He's stunned in that. I don't think he was down, but the next day I saw an article about how the next day they were announcing the fight with Whitaker, and they had or 2 days later, I guess on that Monday, at Tavern on the Green there in New York, and McGirt was there. He was wearing a headband that covered, the swollen ear, and he just looked kind of beat up. And there he is announcing the fight with the best welterweight in the world, while some people thought Chavez was the best welterweight in the world. Of course, if he wasn't the best, if Whitaker's not the best, well, we do know what happened when they eventually fought each other.
Right. And, he also fought and beat Kevin Pompey in 1994. And Pompey was a tough guy, you know.
Yeah, I forgot about that fight, and I wonder. I meant to look to see if that was on YouTube. I wonder if it is.
I mean, some of the names, he definitely fought everybody that was available to him. You know, I laugh when I see Buck Smith on his resume. Buck Smith, it turned out to be a guy that, well, he's a trainer, he's a promoter. You need an opponent, and then he would be the guy. You know, maybe not in '95, but later on. But even towards the end of his career, his last 3 fights, Kevin Tillman wasn't a bad fighter, and he won a 12-round decision against him in 1996. So, I mean, he still wasn't the same Buddy McGirt, but he still was good until, of course, his last fight, and he knew when to say when, and he hung up the gloves in 1997.
Yeah, and I don't know if you noticed, in '95 he fought Joe Gotti. I do think that is the brother of Arturo Gotti, isn't it? And that's sort of interesting because he ends up probably the most successful relationship he had as a trainer. Well, I don't know. There was 2, I would say, Antonio Tarver and Arturo Gotti. I think he had really good relationships with as a trainer.
Yeah, well, after his boxing career, some of the names that he had, like you mentioned, Tarver, Arturo Gotti, Nate Campbell. When he was a champ, Vernon Forrest, Layman Brewster, even Paulie Malignaggi, the famous Paulie. He didn't last long with Paulie. He was the one that stopped that fight against Cotto, wasn't it? Wasn't it McGirt that stopped that fight?
I think so. Yeah, and I think he was also he was on the losing end of the rematch. He was with Casamayor when Corrales beat him. So, and there he was going up against Joe Goosen. So, I mean, he has gone up against some of the top trainers as a fighter turned trainer. I mean, I think that's pretty cool when you think about it. That because some of those guys, they've just been trainers. They weren't world champion boxers, and that's. So I think that's kind of certainly a credit to him as a trainer.
And he's a really cool guy to hang with. He's funny. He could be really funny. He loves those big stogie cigars. You know, you see him. I didn't go to the Hall of Fame this year, but the previous years I've always seen him with that. He came when we did our show out of Vegas for that week. He was came and hung with us a little bit and was a clown. I mean, he's just he's a great guy. I like Buddy McGirt, and we got to get him back on the show soon. But
he does have a lot of personality, and I found there's a clip that YouTube boxing personality there. What's his name? Ellie Seckback has a little interview with James Toney and Buddy McGirt, and they're joking about fighting each other. I'll post that in the social media for the show. It's pretty humorous. And in it, he mentions that, where did I put it now? He said that the hardest fighter he ever faced was Frankie Warren, and the hardest puncher that he ever fought was a guy named Vincent Rutherford. That was the hardest puncher, but the toughest fighter was Frankie Warren. And other than that, James Toney's mother was the toughest guy he ever fought.
That's funny. That's funny. Who'd you put him in against?
Well, I put him in against 3 of the top welterweights of today. And where did I put this? Here it is. I put him in against our friend Money Mayweather. And the first time they fought, it was a technical draw after 5 rounds due to a headbutt. Mayweather was ahead 3-2 in rounds, so I had them rematch right away, and Floyd comes out ahead, winning a unanimous decision. One score 115-113, another 117-111, and one 116-112, all in Floyd's favor. When I had them fight 100 times, McGirt wins 11, loses 85, and 4 draws. He was able to stop Mayweather 4 times, and of the 85 wins that he scored, Mayweather won 13 of them by stoppage. I don't have any problem with that. I think that's what we saw sort of in Whitaker. In Mayweather would be fighting similarly to Whitaker, but a more boring version of Pernell Whitaker. And then I had, then I put him in against Manny Pacquiao. The first time they fought, it was a draw. 114-113 for Pacquiao, 117-111 for Buddy, and 114-114 even. And in that fight, they had a big 10th, Bill, and I thought this was interesting. You would have found it interesting, especially after the post-fight show, the Bradley Vargas post-fight show. That McGirt had a really big 10th round, and two of the judges gave it to him 10-8, even though there was no knockdown. When I had them, I had them rematch because of the draw, and Buddy won the rematch, 117-111, 115-113, and one even card, so a majority decision. I then had them fight 100 times, and McGirt edges him out, 49 wins, 44 defeats, 7 draws. He stopped Pacquiao 16 times. And of his 44 wins, Manny was able to stop James Buddy McGirt 20 times. And finally, I put him in against Tim Bradley because I figure I think he proved he's definitely the third best welterweight the other day, or at least I think he is. The first time they fought, McGirt wins, unanimous decision, 115-112. All three judges had the same score. Bradley was down in the final round. Then when they fight 100 times, McGirt dominates, 58 wins, 27 defeats, 15 draws. He stopped Tim Bradley 5 times, and of his 27 wins, Bradley scored 6 knockouts.
Interesting. Was Pat Russell in that one where Bradley got dropped in the last round? But
yeah. So I think, as history kind of suggests, he does well. He does best against Bradley, and then the other two guys. He did edge out Pacquiao.
Yeah, that one kind of surprises me a little, but maybe it's the size. But Bradley,
I think the size.
Yeah, the Bradley, McGirt Bradley I thought would have been a good fight. But in case you don't know what Alex is doing, we're talking about the Title Bout Championship computer game, which you can get if you visit our website on the left-hand side. You can get information on that. It's a simulation game. It's not video enhanced game or something like that, like some of the other games. But what you're able to do is take these fighters from different eras and put them against each other. And Alex runs when he says I ran the first one and then I ran 100 times. He's running the simulations and getting the best possible averages for these matchups based on their strength and weaknesses and some other settings that you can make. So it's an interesting game, and you guys should get a copy of it. But James Buddy McGirt, former world junior welterweight and welterweight champion, career record, which is impressive. 73 wins, 48 coming by knockout. He had 6 losses in which he was only stopped twice, and he had 1 draw. Now, we're talking about throwback fighter. This is a throwback. His stats are throwback. He fought like a throwback. He fought everybody. 537 rounds as a pro with a 60% knockout ratio. I mean, you got to talk about B-Hop to get these kinds of numbers with the modern fighters of today. James Buddy McGirt, our blast from the past today. He's a great guy, and if you haven't seen any of his fights, definitely go up on YouTube and check him out. Alex, great job as usual. And